There is finally some good news to talk about. After months of uncertainty, rising costs, and anxiety about where prices were headed, there are genuine signs that things may be starting to move in a more favorable direction. But as with most economic developments, the picture is not entirely positive. There is good news and there is bad news, and understanding both sides is important for making sense of what is happening right now and what might be coming in the weeks and months ahead. The core of this story revolves around fuel prices, specifically gasoline and the oil markets that determine what you pay at the pump. And since fuel costs ripple through virtually every corner of the economy, from groceries to shipping to utility bills to construction materials, what happens with oil prices affects far more than just your weekly fill-up. So let us start with the good news. Gas prices have been falling. Not dramatically overnight, but gradually and fairly consistently over recent weeks. According to data from AAA, which tracks national average fuel prices daily, the trend has been moving in the right direction. To put some numbers on it, roughly a month ago, the national average for a gallon of regular gasoline was hovering around $4.51. A week before the most recent data, it had dropped to approximately $4.19. The day before the latest reading, it was around $4.10, and the most recent figure showed it settling near $4.08. That is a meaningful decline over a relatively short period. It is not a sudden crash in prices, but the trajectory has been consistently downward. And for millions of Americans who have been dealing with elevated fuel costs for months, any sustained movement in the right direction provides at least some measure of relief. But here is where the news gets potentially even more encouraging. According to multiple energy analysts, there are reasons to believe that gasoline prices could fall significantly further than where they are right now. To understand why, you need to look at where prices were roughly a year ago. At that time, the national average was approximately $3.13 per gallon. That was before a series of geopolitical disruptions sent oil markets into turmoil and pushed prices substantially higher. Now, analysts are suggesting that as some of those geopolitical pressures begin to ease, and as global oil supply chains adapt and diversify, there is a realistic scenario in which gasoline prices could drop not just back to where they were a year ago, but potentially even lower. Some projections have mentioned the possibility of prices eventually reaching the $2 range per gallon in certain markets. If that materializes, it would represent a dramatic shift. $2 gasoline would reduce transportation costs across every industry. It would lower the cost of shipping goods. It would reduce the price of getting agricultural products from farms to stores. It would ease pressure on household budgets that have been squeezed by elevated costs across nearly every category for months. That is genuinely significant good news. But it comes with important context, caveats, and some bad news that needs to be addressed honestly. To understand why prices have been falling and why analysts believe further declines are possible, you need to understand what pushed them up in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways in the world for global energy markets. It is a narrow passage through which a substantial percentage of the world's oil supply flows. When that passage was effectively disrupted due to escalating tensions in the Middle East, it created immediate pressure on global oil prices. When oil gets more expensive, gasoline gets more expensive. When gasoline gets more expensive, everything that depends on transportation gets more expensive. Groceries cost more because trucks burn fuel to deliver them. Construction materials cost more because they have to be shipped. Utility bills can increase because power generation in many areas still depends on fossil fuels. The cascading effect touches virtually every part of daily life. That disruption was a major factor in the price increases consumers experienced over recent months. Fuel prices climbed into the $4.50 to $5.50 range in many areas. They stayed elevated for a sustained period, and the economic pressure on households, particularly lower and middle-income families, was significant. Now, two things are happening that are contributing to the current price decline and the optimism about further decreases. The first is diplomatic progress between the United States and Iran. Recent reports indicate that negotiations between the two countries have advanced to the point where both sides have reportedly agreed on the text of an initial framework agreement. According to various diplomatic sources, a memorandum of understanding could potentially be signed in the coming days, followed by technical-level talks to work out remaining details. Pakistan's Prime Minister indicated that both sides had agreed on a framework for a peace deal and that preparations were being made for a signing. However, Iranian officials subsequently cautioned that no signing would occur immediately and that more time was needed to finalize the process. This is where the nuance becomes critically important. What has been agreed upon, at least according to available reporting, is a framework. A framework is not a final deal. It is the structural outline of what a deal could look like. It establishes the parameters for further negotiation. It signals serious intent from both sides, but it is not the same as a signed, binding, comprehensive agreement. And this particular diplomatic relationship has a complicated history. The United States and Iran have come close to agreements multiple times in the past, only for negotiations to collapse, tensions to resurface, or military actions to undermine progress. Optimism is warranted based on the current trajectory, but it should be tempered by the reality that nothing is finalized until it is actually signed and implemented. Iranian foreign ministry officials have emphasized the need for caution regarding timing. Their public statements have acknowledged that a deal in the coming days is possible, but have also noted hesitation and the need for careful handling of the process. If a genuine deal is reached and the conflict de-escalates meaningfully, the implications for oil markets would be substantial. Restored stability in the Strait of Hormuz would ease one of the primary supply concerns that has been driving elevated prices. Oil could flow more freely. Markets would likely respond with price decreases, and those decreases would eventually reach consumers at the pump. But even if the diplomatic process takes longer than the most optimistic projections suggest, there is a second factor working in favor of lower prices. Other countries have been finding alternative ways to source and transport oil outside of the Strait of Hormuz. When the strait was disrupted, the immediate assumption was that a critical choke point had been compromised and that global supply would be severely constrained. And initially, that was reflected in higher prices. But over the following weeks and months, something important happened. Nations and companies began adapting. Some countries increased imports from producers that do not depend on the Strait of Hormuz for shipping. Countries like Venezuela, the United States, Canada, Brazil, and others became more attractive sources for nations that had previously relied heavily on Middle Eastern oil shipped through that waterway. Alternative shipping routes were explored. Existing supply contracts were renegotiated. The result is that the Strait of Hormuz, while still enormously important to global energy infrastructure, has become somewhat less singularly critical than it was perceived to be at the height of the disruption. The global oil market has demonstrated a degree of adaptability that many analysts did not fully anticipate. That diversification of supply is significant for two reasons. First, it helps explain why prices are already falling even before a comprehensive peace deal has been finalized. Markets are forward-looking. They price in expectations. And the expectation that supply disruptions are becoming less severe, whether through diplomacy or alternative sourcing, is already putting downward pressure on prices. Second, and this is arguably even more important for the longer term, the supply chain diversification that occurred during this crisis may have permanent effects. Countries that discovered reliable alternative oil sources during the disruption may continue using those sources even after the Strait of Hormuz is fully operational again. That increased diversification makes the global energy market more resilient and potentially keeps prices lower even in the absence of a crisis. Some analysts have suggested that the net effect of everything that has transpired could actually leave the global oil market in a more favorable position than it was before the Middle East conflict escalated. More suppliers competing for market share, more transportation routes available, more flexibility in the system. That competition tends to benefit consumers through lower prices. Now, let us address the bad news honestly, because it would be irresponsible to present only the optimistic side of this picture. First, even though prices are falling, they remain elevated compared to where they were before the disruption. Gasoline at $4 per gallon is better than $4.50 or $5, but it is still significantly higher than the $3.13 average from a year ago. And for families already stretched thin by months of elevated costs across multiple categories, the current prices are still painful. Second, the timeline for further price decreases is uncertain. Even under optimistic scenarios, experts suggest it could take several months for a comprehensive deal to be reached, for oil markets to fully stabilize, and for those savings to be passed through to consumers at the retail level. Oil prices and gasoline prices do not always move in perfect lockstep. Refining capacity, regional supply dynamics, seasonal demand patterns, and other factors can delay or mute the transmission of lower crude oil prices to the pump. Third, elevated fuel costs have already caused damage that lower prices cannot instantly reverse. Businesses that raised prices on goods and services in response to higher transportation costs may not immediately lower those prices when fuel costs decline. This phenomenon, sometimes called sticky pricing, means that the benefits of lower fuel costs may take time to fully reach consumers across the broader economy. Fourth, food prices specifically deserve attention. Transportation is a significant component of food costs, but it is not the only one. Labor costs, packaging costs, weather effects on crop yields, and other factors all contribute to grocery prices. Lower fuel costs will help, but they may not single-handedly reverse food price inflation in the near term. Fifth, there is always the risk that the diplomatic situation deteriorates. If negotiations break down, if military actions resume, or if new geopolitical complications emerge, oil prices could reverse course and climb again. Markets have priced in some degree of optimism about a deal. If that optimism proves premature, the correction could be swift and painful. So where does that leave things practically? The honest assessment is that the trajectory is encouraging. Prices are moving in the right direction. The underlying factors that drove them higher are either being addressed diplomatically or being mitigated through supply chain adaptation. Analysts have credible reasons to believe that further declines are coming, but the timing remains uncertain. The path from here to meaningfully lower prices at the pump is not a straight line. It involves diplomatic negotiations that could stall, market dynamics that take time to play out, and a broader economic environment that is still absorbing the effects of months of elevated costs. For consumers, the practical advice remains consistent with what financial experts have been recommending throughout this period of volatility. Continue managing expenses carefully. Do not assume that relief is immediate just because the trend is improving. Take advantage of lower prices when they appear, but maintain the financial discipline that elevated costs required. For businesses, particularly those in transportation, agriculture, and logistics, the improving outlook provides reasons for cautious optimism but not complacency. Planning for continued volatility is prudent until price stability is clearly established. For the broader economy, lower fuel costs would be a meaningful positive development. Energy costs are embedded in the price of virtually everything. When fuel gets cheaper, it creates breathing room across the entire supply chain. That can support consumer spending, reduce inflationary pressure, and potentially ease some of the financial stress that has been building in household budgets. The diversification of global oil supply chains may prove to be one of the most consequential outcomes of this entire episode. If the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz ultimately led to a more resilient, more competitive, and more diversified global energy market, the long-term effects could be more significant than the short-term pain. That does not minimize the real hardship that elevated prices have caused. Months of higher costs at the pump, at the grocery store, and on utility bills have had tangible negative effects on millions of families. Those effects do not disappear overnight, even when the underlying conditions begin to improve. But the direction of travel matters, and right now, the direction is more favorable than it has been in months. If a deal between the United States and Iran is successfully negotiated and implemented, if global oil supply continues to diversify, and if market conditions allow those improvements to flow through to retail prices, the outlook for fuel costs over the next several months could be substantially better than what consumers have experienced recently. Some experts believe that once these factors fully materialize, prices could settle not just at pre-crisis levels, but potentially below them. That would be welcome news for virtually everyone, from individual consumers filling up their cars, to farmers calculating the cost of getting their products to market, to small business owners trying to manage tight margins. The key word in all of this, however, is patience. The improvements are real, but gradual. The diplomatic progress is encouraging, but incomplete. The market adjustments are underway, but not finished. Things are moving in the right direction. The good news is genuine. But the journey from here to meaningfully lower costs across the economy is measured in weeks and months rather than days. According to experts who study these markets closely, the situation will ultimately improve beyond where it was before the disruption began. More supply options, more competition among producers, more resilient shipping networks. All of those factors point toward a structurally better position for consumers once the current period of transition is complete. Staying informed about developments in the negotiations, monitoring fuel price trends, and continuing to manage household and business finances carefully will help ensure that you are positioned to benefit when those improvements arrive. The situation is not resolved yet, but for the first time in a while, the evidence suggests that better days for fuel prices and the broader cost of living may genuinely be ahead.